Douglas fir where the waters cut through. Down her wild mountains and canyons she flew. Canadian Northwest to the ocean so blue. It's roll on, Columbia, roll on. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Your power is turning our darkness to dawn. Roll on, Columbia, roll on.
The Columbia River rolls on through two countries, Canada and into the United States, and stretches 1,900 miles from the Canadian Rockies to the Pacific coast. The river begins its journey at Columbia Lake in British Columbia and heads north for 200 miles before turning south. While flowing south, the Columbia cuts across the state of Washington and turns west when it meets Oregon. The Columbia River Basin encompasses 270,000 square miles, or is roughly the size of the state of Texas. Getting its lifeblood of water from 7 states, the basin draws from as far south as Nevada and Utah, and east from Wyoming and Montana. Nearly the entire state of Idaho drains into the Columbia, but the 2 states most closely identified with the Columbia are Oregon and Washington. Its most important tributary, the Snake, flows across a semi-arid plain and runs through the deepest gorge in North America, Hell's Canyon, at 7,900 feet deep. The Columbia is a fierce and rugged river that carved its existence out of lava fields, basalt mountains, and forests of Douglas firs. Adorning the banks of the Columbia are cascading waterfalls that crash onto the rocks of streams flowing onto the common goal of the Pacific Ocean. Within the flowing ebbs and tides of the Columbia lives a diverse aquatic world of creatures, both beautiful and prehistoric. Just as iconic and majestic as the Columbia itself, salmon are a precious jewel in the crown of the Pacific Northwest. From the gravel of the rivers that feed the Columbia, each spring salmon fry emerge to begin a journey that will culminate with giving their lives on the same reeds that give life to future generations. Beyond the natural wonder and massive basin that creates the river, man's relationship with the Columbia is both of an infant being nurtured by its mother and that of a master bending a servant to his will. Man has lived by the banks of the river for at least the last 10,000 years. The Columbia has given each generation salmon and other fish as the main staple of early inhabitants' diets. When the Lewis and Clark expedition passed Celio Falls in 1805, the explorers found a great emporium where all the neighboring nations assembled, and a population density unlike anything they had seen on their journey. With the American ideal of manifest destiny and the allure of settling the West, the Oregon Trail brought a wave of people chasing their fortunes. The resources of the Pacific Northwest were as plentiful as the imaginations of the settlers rushing west. The 2 greatest resources were vast and endless forests of timber and 15 to 20 million salmon returning to the Columbia each year. With industrious men finding their way to the Northwest, it was only a matter of time before the kings of the Columbia were harvested commercially. Ezra Meeker, an Oregon Territory pioneer, wrote,
2 men with their boat and net will average their 1,200 pounds of salmon in one night. It is thought impossible to cut short the supply, as millions of salmon pass up the river.
Within 10 years, salmon canning on the Columbia River grew from 4,000 to 450,000 cases a year. By 1877, there were 30 canneries along the lower Columbia River, supplied by 1,000 gillnet boats and employing 6,000 people. By 1883, there were 39 canneries and 1,700 commercial fishing boats on the Columbia, and canneries packed 630,000 cases of spring Chinook salmon. That year, 43 million pounds of the salmon were harvested. Robert Hume, a prominent cannery owner on the Columbia, observed that between 1883 and 1892, the spring Chinook salmon had declined by 3/4. Livingston Stone of the U.S. Fisheries Commission wrote in 1885,
20 years ago, the business of canning salmon on the Columbia was inaugurated. Salmon literally swarmed all the small creeks and little tributaries of the main river, but that day is gone by, probably forever. The vast number of nets that are being continually dragged through the water at the canneries on the main river during the fishing season catch millions of full-grown salmon on their way up the river to spawn.
By 1938, the salmon run was but a faded shadow of its former glory. In that year, Bonneville Dam was completed with a fish ladder and a fish viewing window that allowed workers to count the fish returning over the dam. It's interesting to note that in 1883, the salmon canneries packed 630,000 cases of spring Chinook salmon, and in 1938, only 272,000 Chinook passed Bonneville Dam.
There is a time and place for every man to act his part in life's drama and to build according to his ideas. Just 2 years ago, there came together a small group of men who were fully assured that the time was ripe for the inception of this great work. They set about the task with strong determination and brought it to pass. For dreams will come true if the dreamers work without ceasing to accomplish a purpose, when the purpose is pure. Samuel Lancaster, 1915.
This small group of men set about the task of building the Columbia River Highway. Once completed, the Illustrated News of London called it the King of Roads, the best of all great highways in the world. In just 2 years, these men created an engineering masterpiece that would exceed the greatness of the men who built it.
You have in the Columbia Highway the most remarkable engineering in the United States, which for scenic grandeur is not equaled anywhere. Theodore Roosevelt, 1916.
My love for the beautiful is inherited from my mother. When I made my preliminary survey here and found myself standing waist deep in ferns, I remembered my mother's long ago warning, "Oh, Samuel, do be careful of my Boston fern." And then I pledged myself that none of this wild beauty should be marred where it could be prevented. The highway was so built that not one tree was felled, not one fern crushed unnecessarily. We want you to enjoy the highway which men built as a frame to the beautiful picture which God created, and which is now paired like a city street from the city of Portland through the gorge of the Columbia and into the heart of the Cascade Range. Samuel Lancaster, 1916.
The Columbia River Basin is the most hydroelectrically developed river system in the world. More than 400 dams, 11 run-of-the-river dams on the main stem, and hundreds of major and modest structures on tributaries block river flows and tap a large portion of the Columbia's generating capacity, more than 21 million kilowatts. Lost in the damming of the river is the ancient tribal fishery and communal gathering spot of Celio Falls. This event symbolizes the break between the history of the Columbia and the problems man has created in taming the mighty river. Salmon runs that were once thought to be endless are now near their end. The balance between stewardship of the resource and abuse caused by greed has been crossed, creating self-interest groups intent on putting personal profit ahead of what's best for the resource. And still, the Columbia River rolls on to the Pacific despite new obstacles and barriers constructed in her way.